You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender. And today we're discussing the world's response to the Syrian crisis, including allegations of a chemical weapons attack by the Syrian government last week. Western military strikes had seemed likely after reports emerged of the chemical weapons attack in Damascus, in which hundreds are said to have died. US President Barack Obama had previously said that such an attack would be a red line, and British Prime Minister David Cameron recalled Parliament to approve strikes. But, perhaps unexpectedly, Britain's MPs voted against any military action, and it remains unclear if the US is ready to act alone. So is chemical weapons use a taboo that should be treated differently? And should outside powers be doing more anyway to stop a conflict that is thought to have killed 100,000 people? With me in the studio to discuss this are Dr. Halla Diyabm, an award-winning Syrian writer and filmmaker, and Matthew Jamison, a consultant fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. And on the line we have Mataz Suhail, a spokesperson for the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Dr. Halla Diyabm, what do you make of the British Parliament's decision not to respond to the allegations of chemical weapons use with force? I mean, it reflects public opinion in this country, but is it the right response for Syrians?
I think it was a generational moment yesterday when the parliament votes against military intervention in Syria. And this shows the understanding of the British politicians, even from the Conservative Party, that any military intervention will cause escalation of the situation in Syria, and it will not solve the Syrian crisis. And also that can lead to regional and international war. I believe the solution is not intervention, is not military intervention. The solution now is to deal with the symptoms of the problem, not with the symptoms of the problem.
Mataz Suhail, do you agree that last night's decision in the British Parliament not to take any military action against Syria is the right one for Syrian people themselves?
Yes. We were relieved at Parliament's decision yesterday. I agree with Halla in terms of any escalation of the military conflict in Syria would be detrimental to the lives of ordinary Syrians. It would cause tens of thousands of more refugees and internally displaced people. It would breach or break the necessary links of humanitarian aid and precariousness that a lot of Syrians, more than 6 million Syrians, are now having to live through. And it will inevitably cause collateral damage, as people in the military community would like to call it. A lot of these targets that were leaked to the public were in heavily populated areas. Not to forget that things like the security quarter in Damascus or the Mezze military airport are areas where the regime has detained or has kept thousands of political prisoners, and they would be the first to go. Of course, it would be very delusional to think that anyone responsible for crimes would stay in their offices or places that would likely get hit. We think that the diplomatic efforts of the United Nations, of Al-Akhdar al-Brahimi, of the UN investigation team should be supported, and we wholeheartedly support that all war crimes and all criminals who have committed human rights abuses in Syria be taken to the International Criminal Court.
Matthew Jamison, our Syrian guests say last night's decision by the British Parliament was the right one. What do you think?
I think on balance it probably was the right one, because clearly Britain doesn't have the political leadership that it needs to deal with this situation. The Prime Minister is out of his depth on this matter, and he's displayed that this week in his rather inept and incompetent handling of this matter. So without that political leadership, and quite clearly Parliament is severely divided, and understandably so, because the British public, understandably, they're very wary about being dragged into another conflict in a Muslim country in the Middle East, especially after what happened with Iraq and Afghanistan. So that is understandable why people would be very skeptical about this. I also feel as though really it's gone beyond the point where the West can really make much of a difference externally through military intervention. perhaps earlier, if they had have maybe done more before there was the influx of extremists and so on, that might have made a difference. But I think now it will be counterproductive. And indeed, if they go ahead, of course, which I think the United States will, and France and so on, and there is another chemical attack after they have limited strikes, what happens then? Do we have to go and then, bomb again? It really, I think, needs to be more about the diplomatic, political process.
But of course, the decision to do nothing also has consequences. I mean, whoever it was that did launch a chemical weapons attack in Syria might take this as a green light to do it again anyway.
Well, that's true, and that's why the United States will have to act, because President Obama has really backed himself into a corner. And the credibility of the American president, the credibility of the United States, especially linked to the Iranian nuclear program, because that is also factored in here. The red lines with Iran, if they are seen to be meaningless, then that will have huge repercussions on that issue. So there is going to be some, military strike.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender, and today we're discussing the world's response to the Syrian crisis. With me in the studio are Dr. Halla Diyabm, an award-winning Syrian writer and filmmaker, and Matthew Jamison, a consultant fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. And on the line we have Mataz Suhail, a spokesperson for the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Halla Diyabm, what do you make of this idea that Barack Obama is going to have to ultimately, strike another country basically because he said something a few months ago?
We have history with the American who will go there to the Middle East in order to, in a point that they want to wage like war on terror, as what happened in Bush time, and now it is wage war against chemical weapons and dictators. And then what? We are left in Middle East with remnants of futility of military intervention, like in Afghanistan. We have a country that is torn. There are flux of Islamists and jihadists. People are shot if they go to school, like what happened with Malala. And then Iraq, which is a stateless country, it's full of suicide bombing, it's full of sectarian war. And Syria will be Afghanistan too, or Iraq too. So actually, I don't understand the objective of Barack Obama to go there and bomb these places in order to punish Bashar Assad or to wage war against chemical weapon. It is the same scenario we have heard in Iraq, and it shows that the West doesn't understand actually Middle East, because see what happened in Egypt when you try to implement democracy by violence. You have a reaction to that, which is sectarian and civil war. And I believe the Arab democracy is not American democracy. Arab democracy, it needs time to flourish and for evolution. And the time now is for the local Syrian people and for the Syrian people to act. So they let democracy start from the grassroots, from within Syria.
But Halla Diyabm, as far as I can see, the local Syrian people are acting on all sides, and so far 100,000 people appear to have been killed. So the situation is already like other war-torn countries in the region, and the question is really whether something should be done about it.
Unfortunately, the Syrian people are to be blamed for that because they are divided. We have Syrians inside Syria, Syrian outside Syria, Syrian who are supported by Qatar and Saudi Arabia. They are paid in order to become spokespeople of these two countries. Syrians who become Islamists in order to get support from Jabhat al-Nusra and other Islamic group. There is division, and I think that for Syria to go into the route of democracy, the Syrians should agree on one thing instead of being divided within hidden political agenda. And this had to happen through the support of international community, through support of UN, through support of USA and support of UK. And also, I don't believe that this military intervention is just to hit the chemical weapons. It is just a step in the door for America to start a proxy war on the ground of Syria with Iran. And this will be be done on the interest of my people, of Syrian people, of the mass of the common people. Bashar al-Assad will not be the victim of these attacks. It's the common man.
Mataz, Suhail, we've heard calls for a diplomatic path and negotiations and talks, but none seem to happen. So is it worth continuing to call for them, do you think?
It's absolutely crucial. So far, the Al-Aqsa al-Ibrahimi plan and the Geneva II conference have been delayed and have not been taken seriously by all sides in the United Nations Security Council because of narrow interests and personal interests in the future of Syria. It does not mean that the plan itself is not functional or can't be implemented to save Syria. It is that the United States, for example, delayed a meeting with the Russian foreign minister last week in The Hague in order to push for this argument of military intervention. It's the arguments of the Assad regime continuing in its bombardment indiscriminately of various areas of Syria. It's the Syrian opposition or segments of the Syrian opposition stating again the refusal for the Geneva agreement. All sides that are given airtime are sides that don't want the end to the conflict. There's a lot of people who benefit from it. Syrian people definitely do not. I would also like to perhaps reframe or try to historicize the narrative of the Syrian uprising to probably contest Halla's position. The Syrian people did not begin as fragmented or as intentionally going into a civil war. This is a very horrible outcome. But the intent from the 18th of March 2011 were Syrian people going out to the streets to demand participation in politics in Syria, to demand social justice and to demand dignity initially. And they were not responded to by diplomacy or by reconciliation by the ruling regime. They were dealt with by the regime's military security infrastructure. And that, and the Assad regime's dealing with the Syrian people initially, is the primary cause for the situation we're in now.
Matthew Jamison, does there come a point where you have to say that diplomacy isn't working, that the number of people dying perhaps requires a different kind of action?
Diplomacy, it hasn't worked. I mean, it's been a complete failure over the last 2 years. And the United Nations Security Council has been totally paralyzed. So it is difficult to see how actually diplomacy, will resolve in 2 years. It's already been 2 years. What, another 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, whatever. But I think really we do, in a way, have to stand back, especially after Iraq, which is it was a terrible humanitarian catastrophe that was going on in Iraq before we went in. And then we went in and we probably made it even worse. And we've now made a situation there even worse. So I feel as though it's a really terrible situation and there are no easy answers and it's very complex.
Would it have to be Western forces? Why not an Arab League force, for example? Could that not be...
Well, that would be ideal, but the Arab League doesn't have the capability or the capacity. And maybe Turkey as a leading NATO member, but again, Turkey and some of the other sort of Gulf states and so on, they don't really have the military capability to do something like this. The only country that could decisively change circumstances militarily is the United States. But then at what cost? And what would happen after that?
So we're joined now on the line by Malik al-Abdeh, who is a Syrian journalist based in London. Malik, what's your reaction to the decision by the British Parliament last night not to engage in any military action on Syria? Is this the right decision for the Syrian people, do you think?
Well, I think in this instance, the analogy with Iraq is perhaps flawed. First of all, we have in Iraq, the decision to intervene in Iraq was based on intelligence which was totally incorrect. In this instance, we have verifiable evidence of chemical weapons use. So the issue of the basis of intervention is completely different. So I would say in this instance, the UK government should have, UK Parliament should have voted for intervention in Syria.
Matthew, Jamison, what do you make of that? I mean, we touched on this earlier, but yes, and perhaps looking beyond Syria, I mean, maybe it says to other world leaders that if they're in a tight spot, they can also use unconventional weapons, and it will have little consequences for them.
Well, first of all, there is a core national security concern here, which is Syria does have the third largest stockpile of chemical weapons in the world. And we've seen what already has happened when those have been used. And if they were, God forbid, to get into the hands of al-Qaeda types, then every major Western city would be a target. So that's a very serious security issue which has to be taken into account. Though you can also, work around that in terms of intelligence and special forces. You don't need a huge military intervention to deal with that. Also, the issue about the credibility. Yes, this is very important, and this is why ultimately the United States will act. Probably, the British Parliament. The debate yesterday in the House of Commons was not really very good on all sides. I mean, I think really the three main political leaders have demonstrated that they really are out of their depth, and that we live in an age now of political pygmies, because most members of the House of Commons don't really understand much about the rest of the world. I mean, it's very surprising, but it's extraordinary. They don't really know what's going on outside of the Westminster Village. They don't really understand the issues beyond the UK, and they don't have a very strong grasp of foreign policy. I would feel much more confident if we had someone like Mrs. Thatcher or even Tony Blair, regardless of what you think about their policies and their politics. But in terms of their leadership, they were decisive, resolute, clear leaders. And whether you agreed with them or not, at least they sort of they knew what they were doing. And David Cameron doesn't. I'm afraid after this week, he just you can see that he doesn't have the grip now on foreign and defence policy.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender, and today we're discussing the world's response to the Syrian crisis. Mataz, Suhail, the world seems to be backing away a little bit from Syria. Some Syrians argue that this is leaving the people who are demonstrating and ultimately fighting for what they believe is a better life completely defenceless and without support. Calling for diplomacy is all well and good, but again, if you're talking about political leaders who don't know what they're doing perhaps, and a multipolar world in which no one is really the boss, can diplomacy really lead to the right outcome?
The conflict in Syria, the uprising and then the civil war have magnified to an extent that it's become regional and now an international conflict with sides throughout the globe with positions and stakes in it. Sadly, that is our reality. Any stagnation or further stalling in the Security Council in terms of a diplomatic solution that would secure base interests of all parties would only lead to more casualties in each day. Of course, this is not to forget that the Assad regime has been committing mass crimes. This is not to forget that the opposition has very, very worthwhile and legitimate grievances. But in actual reality, it seems that any other option would be selling the Syrian population a dream that would only lead to further destruction.
Malik, Abdeh, is that a point of view that you agree with?
Well, let's be quite clear. The only thing that Bashar al-Assad genuinely fears is international intervention, Western intervention. And there are signs that even the credible threat of a strike has caused defections within his regime. And therefore, this strike, if it comes, will be the beginning of the end of Bashar al-Assad and will really turn a page as far as Syria is concerned. But doesn't mean in any way that the conflict within the country will end automatically. Far from it. There will be a lot more fighting, perhaps within the rebel groups themselves, between Islamists and nationalists. That may well happen. But at least we will be rid of the regime, and at least we can then focus on building a credible state, a democratic state. But as long as Bashar al-Assad is in power, he is the main obstacle to achieving the aspirations of all Syrians, regardless of their ethnic or sectarian backgrounds.
Halla Diyabm, the West, foreign powers should intervene in order to get rid of Assad, in order to allow Syria a fresh start. What do you make of that?
I think we have to be very clear on the objective of this military intervention. Is it really to get rid of Bashar al-Assad or to punish Bashar or any dictator for using chemical weapon and violation of human rights? To solve the problem of Syria is not only to get rid of Bashar al-Assad, is to dismantle the Assad regime, because the problem is not only Bashar. We have Maher al-Assad, who is in charge of army. So if Bashar goes, Maher, we will still have a problem with the army, Syrian army. Maher, the cousin of Bashar, is in charge of economy. So it's the whole dismantling of the regime. And that can't be achieved by bombing Syria. That might escalate the situation, because the regime will defend itself, it will bomb back, and then we will be involved in a prolonged 15 years of conflict, civil war. If you look at the civil war happened in Lebanon, the only time where it solved when they really sit together in Saudi Arabia and they try to find share the grounds between them. And we can't destroy Syria because we want to punish Bashar. Syria is not about Bashar al-Assad. Syria about Syrian people. It's about the generation. This time for Syria is historical moment. All of us now are, as Syrian, responsible for the safety of the future generation. We need to work hard to get rid of Bashar al-Assad with minimum risk. And this is the support we need from the international community to find a way for dismantling Syrian regime, pushing for a transitional government.
What way would that be?
Why it is easy for the West just to bomb and fight, and not easy for them to seek political solution? They are supposed to be politicians. Are they not the world leaders, politician? If even the opposition is incapable of finding a solution through politics, so they are actually sufficient politicians to lead the country. Politician has the ability to solve the nation problem through politics. That's why they call him politician, not a general in the army. And that's why we need to educate the Middle East about how to solve our political problem through politics, through dialogue, not through fighting. Otherwise, we are going back to the Arabia time where people were fight by sword and they invade each other, and the powerful will invade the weak nation. So there is no progress in the history. And what I'm hearing now is stressing this fact.
Yes, I'd just like to say, I think actually one of the key players that could achieve, through political and diplomatic means, a peaceful removal of the Assad regime. I mean, because personally I feel as though, of course, the whole regime must go. It has lost all legitimacy. Once it started turning guns and bullets and bombs and cluster bombs and all sorts of dreadful things onto its own people, treating its own people like this, no government anywhere in the world has legitimacy then to remain. It must go. I feel that probably the people that could bring that about peacefully the most are actually the Russian government, who have, still a great deal of influence in the Assad regime, and they have the capability and the reach and the access to pressure peacefully and through diplomatic political means to get the regime to step down, and then to start a political reconciliation process with all the groups negotiating. Also, another point is that on the issue of chemical weapons, of course, it's terrible, and it cannot be allowed to stand. However, it's very interesting sometimes, I think, about, the West has such a checkered record on this, because when Saddam Hussein was our friend in the 1980s, and when the Carter administration and the Reagan administration were backing Saddam Hussein against the Iranians in his war, Saddam Hussein used huge amounts of chemical weapons on Iranians, and we did nothing. He also gassed all the Kurds in Halabja in 1988, and we did nothing. So there is a total lack of consistency in Western policy stretching over decades in the Middle East. There's been a lot of hypocrisy, and we have got to find a way forward now to stop these double standards just because somebody may be our friend and ally and we turn a blind eye. But then in other cases, we whip all of this up. So there's a lot that within the United States and Britain and so on we have to address in terms of our Middle East approaches.
Right, we're almost out of time. I just want to ask our guests, in a sentence, if it's possible, what needs to happen next in a bid to address the ongoing bloodshed in Syria? Malik Abdeh.
Well, I think there needs to be without strikes against the regime's command and control infrastructure and against the weapons sites and against military airports. And after that, there needs to be concerted effort on the part of the US, Russia, to reconvene Geneva II for a peace conference. And I think the regime will be, more likely to negotiate seriously once it knows that the international community is serious about using military.
Mataz, Suhail, just very briefly, what needs to happen now?
Geneva II. Briefly, Geneva II needs to happen. The international community and the media need to take it seriously and explain it to the public, who don't seem to know that Geneva II does include, as Matthew said, Russians' capability of agreeing with the US for a transitionary government that would exclude Al-Assad and have a joint opposition and segments of the regime government that would lead within a year to democratic election for the country to move on. All war crimes to be taken to the International Criminal Court.
Dr. Halla Diyabm, what do you think in a sentence?
I urge the Russian government and Mr. Putin to stand with the Syrian people and influence the Syrian regime in order to step down and to come to Geneva II for transitional government and to support the Syrian voices which are helping with or which can support the democratic process in Syria, and not to destroy Syria for the sake of Bashar al-Assad, because Syria is not Bashar al-Assad. Syria is for Syrians.
And Matthew Jamison, a final word from you.
I believe that the great powers at the UN should put aside these power political games that they're playing out, and instead the Kremlin should stop protecting and shielding the Assad regime. It should change its diplomacy at the UN, and it should use its influence and its clout and everything it's got to get the regime out peacefully and then to start a whole political reconciliation, diplomatic process, bringing all the actors together to get a peaceful, just resolution for all Syrians. So all Syrians can have human dignity, universal human rights, and liberty under a rule of law, and that they do not have to live in this terrible, barbaric state of terror and the most appalling situation there. So we've got to work for ordinary Syrians, and it's really key that Russia is a major player in that.
I'd like to thank my guests in the studio. We had Dr. Halla Diyabm, an award-winning Syrian writer and filmmaker, and Matthew Jamison, a consultant fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. And on the line we had Mataz Suhail, a spokesperson for the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, and Malik Abdeh, a Syrian journalist based in the UK. Thank you all very much.